This is Midtown Conversations for Change. I am at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery talking to Crystal Mowry, Senior Curator. And we're interested in talking a little bit about art and representation and some of the ways that images can do harm and racism can be carried through not only our history, but artifacts like our art collections. And I know the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery has been doing a lot of work around this issue. So welcome to the program, Crystal.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. Can you talk a little bit about what you see the role of curators in addressing representation in art?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I mean, I think curators, much like artists, are people who know a tremendous amount about how images can function in the world. Image is our business. That's what we're trained to dismantle, to critique, to understand. But we're also trained to mobilize them to positive and responsible effect. So the role that I see curators playing right now is that of learners. Actually, I think the history of curation has been largely shaped by Eurocentric, white-centered perspectives, and it is our job to be looking differently, to be looking at images, looking at makers differently, and to find ways to decenter that kind of, the perspective that's largely shaped the canons that we've celebrated.
Mm-hmm. So what can you tell me specifically about how the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery is addressing these issues? Because there have been some really innovative exhibitions here in the past couple of years, and certainly you've confronted a lot of this very directly in your work as a curator.
Yeah, this can be challenging work, but it can be also incredibly rewarding work. I feel like most of the projects we've worked on in the last 2 years have been the most transformative ones for me, and you know, I think some folks might expect me to say it's because of the art and it's because of what art can do, but I would argue that it's actually what artists do and the kind of relationships that we have with artists that can change our work. So, for example, we foreground, or we build our successes, we build our exhibitions on our relationships with artists, and that takes time to build. So, rather than approach exhibition making as a sort of cherry-picking endeavor, not that we really do a lot of that, but some curators do, we try to ensure that we have some time to build trust with artists, and this becomes incredibly important when you're working with artists that have historically been overlooked by institutions like KWAG or institutions like any of our other major galleries in Canada or beyond. So taking the time to build trust with the artists is really important. What we also do differently is to give artists the room to respond specifically to our space and to create new things. So we try, in doing things that way, or building exhibitions that way, we're doing it together. We're building something together. So it destabilizes the kind of hierarchies that museum work has typically endorsed.
Mm-hmm. And I find it very interesting, particularly at KWAG, because this is a contemporary art gallery, but it also has a very vast collection. It has a massive vault full of all kinds of interesting and historic works. And sometimes when we're engaging, reaching back into our past, some of the representations that we pull out are very problematic. And so what is the work? What role can that art still play? Does it need to remain in the vault? Can we face it head on? How does a curator make those decisions?
Oh, we have to face it head on. We know it's there. We have to face it head on. And if we don't know it's there, I think it's our responsibility to find it. So, one example might be in 2017, we had an exhibition that was guest curated by a wonderful curator based in Toronto, Lisa Myers. And Lisa was looking at the various ways in which contracts and documents and petitions, agreements, all of that stuff, all of that paperwork can tell us a story of erasure. And one of the works in that exhibition was a piece by a Toronto-based artist named Deanna Bowen. And Deanna Bowen is very interested in the histories of black histories within Canada and the U.S. And she's a black artist. She's working in Toronto. She's very interested in family histories too, so her family is centered in her project. So this work that she created was a petition, and essentially what it was a reproduction of a historical document, a document that can be found in national archives. And in the process of preparing this work for exhibition, this 264 or more page document, we discovered a name on this petition. It was essentially an anti-black petition that was sent to Sir Wilfrid Laurier, I think in 1919. I could be wrong about that date. And the petition was basically a call to remove black people or prohibit black people from entering the province of Alberta. We found a name on this agreement, on this petition, a name that we recognized instantly. It was a name of an artist who we knew was in our collection. Well, we couldn't ignore that fact, and it forced us to think about that name, that artist, their canon, differently. And a decision was made quite late in the planning for that exhibition to bring that realization, that discovery, into the context of this show. It required collaboration, honest, open conversation with the artist and the curator and our registrar here who cares for the collection. It was one of the most incredibly transformative experience I've had as a curator. That realization has then gone on to inform that artist's practice, Deanna's practice, and has led her to look more deeply into racist legacies within the Canadian artistic canon, or the canon, and when I say that I mean like the canon that really privileges the group of seven and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So there's some sort of an interesting process here where new work can also then engage with historic work and create a dialogue that allows us to not only understand past wrongs and past racisms, but also hopefully sort of bring people around to understanding the current state of racism and the way that racism is embedded in our cultural institutions and continues to be a factor in people's lives, as we're seeing, in the news today in pop culture.
For sure, it's insidious, and one of the things I think is so important for us to remember as arts workers and people who work with artists is to be aware of the kind of labor that is involved in constantly doing that work. So when I think about artists like Deanna who seem tireless and who are making incredibly powerful, vital work, she's also taking on a type of labor that could be paralyzing for a lot of artists. And we have to think carefully about how racialized people, Indigenous people, queer people might be asked to do this extra labor of educating institutions, and what kind of cost that ends up bearing on their practices.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's, an unfair ask at times that the most marginalized groups in your industry then are the ones who have to fight to have this position, that they have to deal with the representational mess that the legacy of racism has left behind. And for big institutions, that fight is still ongoing. There are still very significant critiques out there in terms of counting the number of women who are wearing clothing in art in museums versus or who are not wearing clothing versus the number of female artists, these kinds of things. And we think about it, you think back to Trudeau saying because it's 2015 or because it's because it was 2001 and when he was performing in this very problematic way. So how do we how do we take that next step to really ensure that all of our leaders are on the same page, and in the arts community, moving to make sure that the right voices are in the right institutions and not having to have all of the onus on them to do that additional labor.
I think you just said something that is essentially my answer, which is, looking around the room, the kind of first step that I see as being integral to any kind of work, recuperative, restorative, or if some folks want to call it reconciliatory kind of work within institutions, is to look around the room and take note of who is not there, and also think about why they're not there. Why your conversations may be different because they're not there. All of that stuff, it's such important work. And then it's not necessarily the writing of grants, it's not necessarily the spending of money, but it's the unpacking of the systemic barriers that have made it possible for bias to exist.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of projects are exciting you these days? Like, what do you see coming up that will be, you think, transformative or will continue to do this work?
I mean, I always love when artists are working with the past, and that's, or artists who are thinking about time in incredibly rich and risky ways. So I was mentioning Deanna Bowen. We're working with Deanna on a project that is right now a version of this project is at the University of Toronto's Art Museum, but it's going to be expanded for KWAG in fall 2020. And that project looks at, again, these canons, specifically the group of 7 in Canada, and starts to unpack all of its tentacles into various social circles in where money figures prominently, opportunity is plentiful, and where there are racist legacies of red face, legacies of black face. So working with Deanna, we're going to start to bring works from our own collection into this conversation to address head on how we are not we're not absent from this history, these negative histories, or these histories of racism.
And you're obviously engaged in collections all the time, so you see these histories as part of your daily job. Is there a time when you were faced with, you found a piece in the collection and you thought, ugh, I can't even believe this exists? Like, when's the last time you were really shocked?
Oh my God, yeah. Okay, that has happened a couple of times, and usually those conversations I have with my colleague, who's our registrar. We have them after hours, and the works. I could say, we have over 4,200 works in the collection, so there's still things that I know I'm discovering about the collection, but there are works where we think, my goodness, how could this have possibly made it through the vetting process for new acquisitions, 30 years ago. Well, yeah, and then I think back, well, what did our institution look like at that time? Who were the people in the position of making decisions like that? Who held power? And in most institutions, when you're looking at 30 years ago, they are largely men and white men, and so how does that affect the kind of images that you start to see entering into collections? So yeah, there are some works that I would say have inappropriate subject matter that would be so difficult to show or include in an exhibition. But there are also works like studies, drawings of racialized people, and drawings made by white artists who were traveling the world and finding subjects in the people they were coming into contact with, and at some point a decision was made to title those works, give them names like Inuit Boy or Inuit Boy or Inuit Woman, and you think, well, that couldn't have been the way that the subject was necessarily thinking of themselves. So that's another kind of colonial act, right? The erasure of identity and specificity and individuality. So we've been rethinking how those works are named, and this is an act that a lot of institutions with varying levels of varying resources, oftentimes resources that are quite different than ours, who are going back to these works and renaming them, reconsidering how they should be identified for the public. So changing their names to, young girl or mother and child, naming the works in a way, or actually acknowledging that the names have been changed and providing a rationale for why that name has been changed or that title has been changed.
Mm-hmm. And as we sit here, listeners may be able to hear children playing in the background. It's the public programming that you have here at KWAG. And I just want to end talking about that, about education and arts education and the role that facing some of these histories or current missteps in representation, and how that actually plays an educational role, and how we can use that to teach people about our past and our current issues and the importance of art in doing that.
Our staff who work in our public programs department are creative, resourceful folks, and they often, almost always, take their lead from what artists do. So, I think they're people who have their eyes open all the time. They also learn from the folks that they get to spend time with, who are sometimes young people, like the people in the hallway. And I think I'm a parent. I have a young child, and my son has grown up here. So we have conversations about the world with art in the background all the time, and that's a tremendous gift I think I can give him. And I always, wherever possible, try to remind people that the gallery exists for them. This is not an elite resource where only certain people can make use of it. Like we have a collection that lives here for the enjoyment of our community. So make use of it. Learn here. Learn with us.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Crystal.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.